Hello from London. Well, it's Thoughts on Thursday, and today I want to share with you the second part of my recent talk to Gary McCann's My Language Challenge group. The topic is tuning in to your target language. What do I mean by that? Well, as I explained in the first part of the talk, which was a video that's already appeared here on the channel, I meant first of all tuning into the soundscape of the language. That's pronunciation, rhythm, intonation, and so on. But it's not only that. And today, in the second part, we're going to look at two other aspects of tuning in. So, without further ado, let's dive straight in.
Language. So that's the soundscape. And then the second is pragmatics of the language. So the culture of communication, if you like. Find out about rules about eye contact, smiling. When you're actually physically present, how close are you supposed to stand to the other person? In Russia, for example, it's much more normal to stand rather closer than in Britain, where we have more this idea of personal space. We tend to smile a lot more. The Russians or the French, if you smile at people you don't know, they'll think you're up to no good or you're a bit, weak in the head. What about volume? I keep mentioning my Catalan housemates. There's no doubt the standard volume setting in Spanish and Catalan is higher than it is in British English. What's the speed that you speak? That might change in different parts of the country as well. How much do you speak to people you don't know very well? Modes of address, I mentioned tu and vous are their formal levels of politeness. Japanese is known for this. Learn about those two. Read about them, ask your teacher about them, Google for them. Are there taboo topics? When I was in Russia, my parents came to visit and we were at a friend's house having some food and they kept asking me to ask my parents how much their pension was. Yeah. Now, in Britain, it's easier to ask somebody about their sex life than it is to ask them how much they earn. Generally, it, for some reason, is a taboo topic to talk about money. And this can be even true within families, among siblings, depends how well you know the person, but find out. And, learn set scripts as well. So things like bowing and greetings, how are you? In English, when we say how are you, we don't want the history of the last 2 weeks of your life, yeah? Learn the conventions, learn how figurative speech is used. Are you in the right register? So among young men in Russia, the way they speak to each other is different from if one of those young men is talking to his grandmother, to a professor. Learn about register, try and stay in the right register. So that's the soundscape. It's the culture of communication, narrowly understood in terms of the pragmatics. And then the wider culture. A lot of, even if you're really high level, you will be left floundering if you're not familiar with, for example, the geography of the country. You need to know all the place names. Sometimes the adjective may just relate to the place name. And I'm looking in a dictionary and it's actually just a reference to a place name, which might not be there. You need to then know about the history of the country sometimes, because characters, events, institutions may come up in conversations or colour the discourse in some way. A quick way in is to read Wikipedia articles. You could do it in the language if you're good enough, but in English if you're not. A quick potted history. Obviously the more you travel in the country, read about it in your own language too, the more you'll have to go on. Learn a bit about its institutions too. There are things like military service, or it's got some cooperative economic tradition. These things might be referred to. Kibbutz, for example, was a big thing in Israel. Try and learn about these religious aspects too, because there's going to be vocabulary perhaps which will come in. And then proverbs and sayings, which might be linked with getting to know the literature of the country, getting to know films of the country. It might even be phrases which we call sort of winged phrases, which come from advertising, for example. But these then might be used in the language only partially. So you might just say the end of a phrase. So if I say, it takes two, it was partly his fault. There's this phrase, it takes two to tango in English. You might not hear the whole phrase. And then you might be left not understanding what on earth it's about. Now, obviously, it takes a long time and a lot of engagement to develop that sort of depth of understanding. But finding a way, and no one can know it all, but it's a great feeling of being in the in crowd when you do get certain references. I like to use newspaper headlines for this. They can be, I can sometimes see a newspaper headline in London when I'm going into the underground, where you have to know one show that was on telly 15 years ago and one catchphrase. Otherwise, even if your English is perfect, you won't be able to understand the joke or the wordplay of the headline. Now, in a way, that's a bit depressing. So remember, if you can't understand, though, on the other hand, it might not be something that's wrong with your language. It might be something that's just coming from the wider culture. And so it's about long-term engagement, taking an interest, and really living the language. So those are the three things, the thing that for me, of the tuning in principle, that to me are characteristic of successful language learners and communicators, whatever specific methods they're using. Is that they really take the sound and the pronunciation and the intonation of the language seriously. They keep going back to it. They're interested in the way, the conventions around how language is used, how speech is used, how people interact with each other. And they're also right in there, swimming around, floundering around in the wider culture, going into it through the bits that they're interested in. You don't have to suddenly become interested in opera in Italian if you're not interested in opera in English necessarily. But get involved as fully as you can, whichever way in works for you, to start to understand the wider culture as well.
That then is my take on tuning in to your target language, whether we're talking about the soundscape of the language itself, the cultural conventions around how it's used, and of course the history, the literature, the low, the high culture of the language community and communities themselves. I hope you've enjoyed this talk in its two parts. As always, thanks a lot for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for the vibe, throw me a thumbs up, tickle that bell, and share the affair. And do check out mylanguagechallenge.com, Gary's program. There's a link underneath this video. See you next time. Bye.